So we have Zend Authentication established. It's created using the factory, and we can do basic credential check. But that's hardly enough. There are still three major questions that remain unanswered. One, we need to get a full user object back, not just a string representation of whatever Active Directory gave us. We need a proper PHP object back. Two, what happens to the connection that we have established to do the authentication? Most likely we're going to need to query LDAP or any other backend multiple times. So are we going to spend extra resources creating new connections? Can we reuse the one that has been established by authentication? Or can we create a connection that is used both by the main application and Zend component? Finally, what happens to the identity? How is it stored so that the next time the user logs in, we have the identity readily available? Is it stored in memory or maybe a database, or can we set up an option? What if we want to reuse the identity with a state of what the user has been doing to save their work the next time they log in? When learning a new component, it's always a good idea to at least once walk through it with the debugger. Let's watch what happens all the way from the beginning of its creation. At the service factory, put a breakpoint when the authentication service is going to be created, run the script, and watch what happens as we walk through it. We're going to go into the next call, and we got composer autoloader, which is quite boring. Let's get out of here. That wasn't a good start. But anyway, moving on, we're going towards the constructor, which says that it can take in optionally storage interface and adapter interface. We chose to do them through setters, so we have a more controlled way of injecting dependencies. So we've gone through setting them if they're available. Here we go, setting the adapter. Set adapter, takes an adapter interface, puts it in internally, nothing overly special, and returns it. Service manager does its thing, not interested in it. You can walk through it as you want, so get out. Then we check if something has an identity. Okay, so here's an exciting piece for a change. We got a get storage. And in fact, even when we get the identity ourselves, we can get the storage first and then get an identity from the storage. Identity doesn't actually come directly from an authentication service, and we see that right here. We actually get the storage. Let's see how it does it. So we're going to here, and here's an interesting piece. If the storage wasn't set, it's going to create a new session. Well, that's interesting. We never considered anything about storage, which is dealt with an adapter. And not just that, what is the storage? Storage sounds like, is this where the usernames are stored in a database? Not exactly. This is a different meaning of the word storage. So anyway, if we have not passed in storage, whatever it may be, it's going to create a new one. Composer again. Session. Okay, so we're going into session somehow. So this storage is not a database storage, as we may want to believe from the name of it. It's actually a session storage. And let's see what it does. It looks at a namespace. So it has a namespace that it uses if we haven't given it one, and it happens to be Zend_auth. Okay, let's keep that in mind. It may be something of use. And it creates a container. So we got a session storage, and then it wants to create a container from that storage. Composer again, boring, get out. Abstract container. Okay, we got complicated things about containerization, probably how things are stored within the overall session. Makes sense. If you have more than one component competing for space in your session, it's probably a good idea to have each component have individual storage container. So that's what probably this is doing. Now what else we see is that it's using a session manager. So that kind of makes sense. We have something that we want to store in session. There are possibly more than one component that wants to use the session, so you want to have each component in their own container. And then how do we know what container goes where? We probably want a manager of those containers somehow. At least that's my guess, that's my pattern of thinking. We have this set manager with a parameter, and it's protected. So it looks as if it's giving us a chance to set a manager if we choose to. And in fact, that has been a recurring theme throughout all of these. The framework never sets anything directly. If it wants to give something a value, it always passes it through an internal set. That internal set also happens to be a public set. So we seem to have an opportunity to inject our own custom functionality in all of these little places, and my debugger session timed out. So we stopped right around here. So we can refresh it and resume from that point. Moving along, we're back to a container constructor. Array object, so it just looks like a utility for array. Setting some flags. Just a wrapper for PHP array functions for convenience, it seems. And we start in the manager. Getting it again, so again, it doesn't access the parameters directly. Everything goes through a getter, as we see in a stack tray. So if we just go one level before we got here, it still gives us opportunity to override it because it's public. So that may be significant for you if you want to have your own manager, you want to control how you store everything in sessions. Session manager starts. Session exists. This looks like a connection to the PHP session. We're still in session. Set in the storage. Back at authentication now. Now here's interesting. We're in session, but under authentication namespace. So we had a session that was its own component, and now we have a session that is authentication storage namespace. So that's interesting. So it seems like this is an adapter to the session. So session is a whole separate Zend Framework component, but looks like authentication component cannot talk to the Zend session component directly. It needs this adapter in the middle. So let's see how it does it. We got a session that we seem to have created earlier through the constructor. And let's see, we got this session. Yep, that's the session component itself, separate from authentication. And now we have this member. So it accesses it through a magic method. I know it's magic because there is no explicit setter. It uses curly brackets. And it uses this member as the key for the magic method. Let's see what this is. This member is storage. So we got namespace Zend auth and member storage. Let's see how that's used, keeping these two values in mind. We got our magic method as expected, and we are at array object, which is outside of the authentication. So we're talking through adapter now, and we see that it uses storage as the key. So what does that tell me? That tells me we have some kind of container, and it doesn't even have to be specifically a session container. The whole point is we have a container with a certain name. It was Zend auth, so we can differentiate that this container belongs to the Zend authentication component. But that container may have multiple members of it. And how do we know what we're looking for? We're looking for storage. Now we're just querying for the key. Let's get out of here. Here's our getter. We're getting our key again. Out of here. Events, we got some events. I think this is now me going towards the controller, isn't it? Because we are way outside of everything. Yep, we got route matching. Okay, so we're definitely out of the authentication and session realms. So out of all of this, okay, and we have completed the script. So that's as far as getting an identity, reading from the storage. Now let's see what happens during the authentication. Let's clean up all the breakpoints that we have. We've got a bit too many going on now. Delete them. And I want to focus on actual authentication. Over to index controller. Over to authenticate. Okay, we begin straight away by looking at an adapter. So we could have given the authenticate method adapter as opposed to in the factory. And it tells us that if the adapter hasn't been given to us by this point, so we had 2 opportunities to do it, 2 chances. At this point, if we didn't take those chances, we're getting an exception. Well, we've been good, and so exception doesn't apply to us. Get the adapter, again, not directly, but through a getter. Authenticate. And we're going to LDAP. Okay, that's expected. We were working with LDAP adapter indeed. Checking that we got the username set. If we don't, we have appropriate errors for that. LDAP get adap. Okay, I see something interesting coming. There we go. We're getting LDAP, and I don't actually remember setting an LDAP object. So it's creating a new one. Okay, so could I have possibly given an LDAP connection ahead of time? Because see, now it's going outside of the authentication adapter LDAP and into LDAP component itself. See? Zend LDAP SRC LDAP, completely outside of authentication. A controller to establish the connection and options. We've seen these options before. Setting them. Verifying that the options that we passed it are among one of the permitting. Messages are being established. That's the result set that we've been getting, whether it was a successful authentication or not. Conversion of options, some low-level stuff, not interesting. Authority name. Okay, just reading the options. Okay, so it takes the keys of the options and gives them a nicer name. So authority name is actually the main name. It's a more programmatic way of accessing the array of options as opposed to just hacking at the keys of that array. These are very good techniques. Like, this is a very nice clean code. So another good reason for me to look through this is it tells me how I should be structuring my code, because this is a very good way of doing it. Get canonical name. Again, it doesn't hack at the array keys directly. It uses a setter that knows exactly how to parse the array keys. We will step over that. Doing a bind, this is the connection. So it takes a username and password and creates a connection from it. Getting codes, if any. Then we are checking whether it has a identity. And if it does, it clears it. So if you authenticate multiple times, it actually deletes the previous identity and gives us a whole new one. Once it does that and it verifies that authentication is successful, it gets the storage again. We've already been through that, so we'll skip it. And it does a write to it. But, so writing it, get storage, we've been here. And back at our controller. with our successful result. So lots of stuff happened, but not necessarily get a good idea of what it is doing, what all the interfaces are, how it all fits together. So let's look at a nice diagram that probably took longer to draw than it will take me to explain what it is. We got authentication service, and it takes in two interfaces to do its job. The idea of interface is you can only fit a component that fits its shape. So if you're still getting used to the programming terminology, let's say that for authentication service to work, it needs something that is in the shape of a star and something that's in the shape of a square. The square shapes are the adapters. The adapters can be either LDAP, the one that we're using from Active Directory or Apache DS. It can be HTTP digest from Apache. It can be database table, where we'll do that one next. Or it can be anything else that also has a square in it. Following that, we need something that has a star shape. And for star, we're going to designate storage interface. So storage interface is something that authentication service uses to keep the user's data between page requests. And of course, because it's just an interface, as long as we provide another object that has a star shape, we are good. So we're not restricted to just a session storage. And we store them. So store them in the application lifetime, not permanent storage. Now, because this storage may be shared by other components since it is part of the application lifecycle, we're going to need to give it a key so we can query for it within memory. But since more than one component probably compete for the session, each component needs to have a container for it. And that container is found by key Zend Auth, or whatever key we give it. See, we have a slot for the names of the container. And then the data within the container has its own little slot. But containers need management somehow. So to be managed, the container has a plus shape, and the plus shape can take in a manager. So the manager will manage multiple versions of the storage systems. The next question is, how exactly are we storing the container within the lifetime of application? We can choose PHP's session, the $_session, or we may use our own. The reason why we may use our own is $_session, the PHP's native session, is volatile. That is, every time the PHP restarts or user goes away and logs back in, that session is completely destroyed. So if you either want an option of keeping the user data when a server restarts, less likely, but more realistically speaking, if you want to resume the user session from when the user logged out, so say user is going through some kind of wizard, and the wizard has 10 steps. The user reached step 5 and now wants to do it in a different computer. Maybe you want to go home, maybe he wants to complete the wizard the next day. So presses save, logs out. How is that going to be saved? You cannot save it in a session because that session is now destroyed since the user logged out. So the session storage for our application lifetime identity is not a good idea anymore. We want to store the session within a database perhaps. Now again, that's not storing the user credentials, that is storing the state of the user after they log in, all of the objects, all of the permissions, all of that. So that gets stored, so the next time the user logs in, that identity can be restored. Now, Zend Framework doesn't give us a predefined DB storage because they say there are too many ways this can be done. This is very customer specific, so we will be making our own. But it does provide a session storage. Remember back when we were concerned if we are creating unnecessary connections to the LDAP server? Well, if we take advantage of the square shapes or the adapter interface, we can create an LDAP connection ahead of time and pass it to the authentication service. Authentication service will know to use it because of all the if statements that check if the internal variable is null. If it was never set before, it will create a new one, but if we do pass something in, it will use it. Alternatively, we can use authentication service as a factory for connections. So if we do not want to make our own LDAP service, we don't want to make our own relational database for MySQL or Postgres, we can take the authentication service and do a get adapter on it. Even if it's not related to authentication, what we want to do, we'll just take an adapter, treating it as a factory, and do something else. Not something I want to do. I definitely want my own LDAP service. To customize the functionality based on what we've seen in our walkthrough, we first need to lay down some expectations. The test we will write is not going to be a unit test, but an integration test, since it will span several components. It's not going to test individual functionality, not something as tiny as making sure that the user gets split appropriately at the @ sign, but how the data travels, beginning all the way at the top left corner from the adapter of Identity Manager, all the way out into the bottom right corner where we're storing into the session. In the authentication service factory test, we will add another one for test identity created. Identity is actually going to come from session container. Not session that is authentication adapter, but session that is a Zend component. Session container, and right now it's having a bit of a hard time knowing where session is coming from, so we will help it a little bit by pointing it to the namespace. Zend session, and we're getting a container out of it. But we need to specify what the container key is out of all the possible components that may be competing for the session namespace. That will follow this slot in the container box. That name, as we know, comes from the authentication's namespace. So authentication dictates what namespace you're coming from. So that session is authentication storage and namespace default. Now, because session here versus session in the authentication is confusing, we're going to leave a full name like that, except maybe Zend. Probably get rid of the Zend portion. And we'll put it up above all other authentication declarations. So now it makes a little bit more sense what session belongs to where. We got a container that's a session component, and we got session that is authentication storage adapter. Now this is actually a container. Identity will come out of it later. Being an integration test, I have no reservations against creating a full instance of the service without isolating any components. So making an authentication service stub from the authentication service factory we already have. Down in the actual test, we can do this service manager get authentication, which will give us auth service factory, authentication service factory, which gives us authentication service when we use it as a function, with the service manager as a parameter. So replicating what we already have in the index controller when we were playing around. Authentication service. This authentication service will give us an adapter. Now you could ignore the interface warning and just do set identity straight away, but I don't like extra warnings. Development is hard enough for me to be sipping through real warnings and figure out which ones are false positives. So I will follow the IDE's advice and specify that this is actually an LDAP authentication adapter. Adapter set identity, which is going to be the same as one here, and adapter set password, same one we played with earlier. Then we have to perform the authentication. Careful to run authentication function on the service, not the adapter. The difference is the adapter will just fetch the object from the directory server, and that's it. But the authentication service will both fetch the identity from the identity server and store it in the session memory. Now, since we're storing at the moment in memory, it would be a good idea to force the authentication service to clear identity before our test, just to make sure we don't have any rogue leftover data. Having a container, we can get an identity, which we can get by querying the container for the key. This key is controlled by the storage session member default constant. Because we use curly brackets as opposed to a getter or a direct property, this is going to invoke a magic getter. Because the IDE doesn't catch the breakpoints very well when they are at the end of the functions, I have to put these extra annoying return statements so I can cleanly put a breakpoint and make sure it actually gets executed. Run a test, and our identity returns the username that we want. Let it run. Now the unit tests need to have a proper assertion, so it actually has some meaning. We're going to say that this assert equals, we got the expected first. I always mix those up. The expected is Alex stack ZF tutorial identity, and we run the test. We got both assertions pass. Just having a string as an identity is not what we want. It's quite useless. We want to eventually get to our ZFT entity user object. But this is a good place to start before we make the adjustments to reach that goal. So this is a good place to make a commit. We say establish expectation for authentication data flow from object creation to in-memory session identity member. Before that, we still need to extract the LDAP service connection so it can be used in other parts of the application. And as we extract it, we need to make sure that this test remains passing.